I moved that rear axle forward another inch, and I'm not too sure. I don't know. It definitely looks different. I might have taken a little bit too much out of the wheelbase. I might move it back an inch. I don't know. We'll see. All right, y'all, confession time. Yesterday I tried to film a positive outro to the last video, but to be honest, yesterday sucked. I really hate having to redo stuff. I get really hard on myself when I think I planned and things don't come out the way they should because of a critical error or stupid error or something I overlooked. Things aren't perfect. Things are almost never perfect. When you have a win, when you have a good smooth day in the shop, that's a win. I messed with the back end on this thing. I cut 2 inches out of the lower links and brought the axle in. I ended up cutting another inch out of it. I cut 3 inches out of the tail section of the buggy. I hate having to do that stuff, but this is the stage in which you should do that stuff. It's really the best time to do it. I would rather do it now than get further down the road and figure out, you know, I wish I woulda or I shoulda. Anyway, I mean, all that being said, having to redo stuff, having to cut and chop and grind and re-weld, that's not as big of an issue as yesterday just being unhappy with the balance of the buggy. After I brought this rear axle in, I feel like now, I guess maybe just because I'm used to the way it did look, I feel like now it's not balanced. And when I mean balanced, the cab, I feel like the cab is too far back. It's not centered between the axles and the wheelbase. And if you missed the last video, what spurred all this on is I realized that my wheelbase was way longer than I wanted it to be. It was, I think, 122.5 inches long, which for a 4400 car or a 4800 car on 37-inch tires is way too long. There comes a point where you kind of got to figure out what you're going to be doing with the car and setup and tires and wheelbase, belly height. There's all these things, all these factors, and I thought I had all of that sort of figured out, but yesterday I learned I didn't. And it's just because it's an error on my part, obviously, but long story short, learn from my mistake. Whenever possible, set up the front end first. The reason being is because you can only do so much with the front end. There's limitations in packaging on the front end. You have the steering axle, you have steering angle, you have a front drive shaft. In my case, I have a high pinion, which a high pinion 9 sits way higher on the axle, which makes packaging even more challenging. And once you get that front axle figured out where you want it, there's only so much you can do with it. I mean, you can only bring it back so far. You can only set your links up at such an angle because, you know, if you have a lot of steering angle like this axle does, the links can't be too far out because your tires are going to rub at full lock when they're turned all the way to the lock. You know, there's all kinds of factors. The rear end, on the other hand, is easy. There's nothing going on back there. You don't have a steer axle unless you're building a rear steer vehicle, but on this car I'm not. It's a drag axle, so the rear end is easy. Set up the rear end after you get the front end figured out, and then set your wheelbase from where the front end is to the rear end. And I sort of did it backwards, and I don't recall why I did it that way. I think it was I was waiting on parts. Was I waiting on the? I think I was waiting on the unit bearings, or I was waiting on the steering pump bracket, which isn't going to work for me anyway. I don't know. Moral of the story is, yesterday sucked. I was discouraged. I was mostly discouraged just because of the way the buggy looks. I'm just not used to it. I was on Instagram this morning and I asked a few questions of some of the guys that I know and trust that are racing in 4800 class, and I asked, what's the ideal wheelbase? And the ideal wheelbase for the majority of people, it tops out at 117 inch. So now I've got this set up at 119 where I had originally intended it, and 119 on a 4800 class car, which is limited to a DOT 37 inch tire, is going to end up being a challenge in some of the rock trails because of the breakover angle. Because your belly's going to be really low to the ground. You're going to end up turtling up. 37 inch tires, you don't have as much clearance as you would with a bigger 39 or a 40. However, you know, this car, I want to set it up to where it can race in the 4800 class, but if I keep it, I'll probably end up running these 40s. So I want it to be sort of a crossover, sort of a multi-purpose, pre-runner race car. So I want to set it up to where I can use it with the 39, 40 inch tires. I think what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take an inch out of the front links. I really didn't want to do that yesterday. I was, you know, I'm really happy with the way the front end is set up right now. But, you know, on sleeping on it last night and thinking about everything that's going on and what's going on here, I think I can take an inch out of the front links. They're temporary links. They're mock-up links. They're just Hiru tubing. They're not permanent. I can take an inch out of it and see what happens if I bring that axle back 1 inch. I have plenty of room up front in front of the engine. The only question is going to be that high pinion and the amount of bump I can still get out of it. If I decide it doesn't work, you know, I can, for mock-up, I can adjust those links outward. There's plenty of room in the Heim joint to adjust them outward and lengthen them back out again. If I do that, then I'll be at 118, and I think 118 is fine. You know, maybe it's not ideal for some of the rock trails on 37s and a lower belly height, but I've wheeled my other buggy at 119 for years, and I recently upped it to 121 and a half, 122 with the new axles, and it's been great. Now, granted, that's on 39 inch sticky tires. My belly height's, you know, quite a bit higher. So there's give and take, and there's going to be a trade-off, but I feel like maybe if I move that front axle back just a little bit, I'm going to have the balance that I'm looking for in front to rear, where the cab is, where the front end sits, where the rear end sits. It's an aesthetic thing, and it's probably last on the list, but really, to me, it's important. The design and the look of it is just as important as the function. So I think that's what I'm going to do. If anything, you know, obviously I don't know everything. I'm still learning. Hopefully people that are watching this, you guys that are watching this, can learn from this. And you know, when you're working on your chassis and working on your build, you know that these things come up. And I think that might be why there's a lot of projects that just never get finished, because people get discouraged, they get burned out, they run into problems, and you know, other things, I don't know, budget, whatever. But momentum is everything. Whether it's in racing, whether it's in playing ball, anything. Momentum is everything. So I'm going to keep the momentum going. I'm a grinder. Things get me down a little bit. I get a little discouraged, but I keep on going. I don't know. Hopefully you guys are the same way. That's the only way to be in life in general. So in light of everything, this is not a big deal, but I thought I would share with you what I go through and what happened yesterday. I try to put a positive spin on it in the last video and the closeout, and yeah, it just was all day hanging over me like, man, this sucks. And it does suck, but it's part of the deal, man. That's why we do this. If it was easy, everybody would do it, right? So anyway, that's the plan today. I've got the buggy pulled out. We got a nice day today, so I can stand back and really look at this chassis, really look at the balance, and see what it looks like from afar. I wasn't able to do that yesterday. I was really close up on it. So I've got some room in the shop today. The buggy's pulled out, and I can get after it. So anyway, here we go. better to me. I don't know if it's a mental thing or not, but 1 inch makes a difference. So I'll move that front axle back 1 inch. I articulated it. I still have pinion clearance. I would need to slide the chassis forward to check for tire clearance and rubbing, but I don't think that's going to be an issue. I had plenty of room. I had well more than 1 inch between the end of the tire here and this tube here when the tires turned at full lock. So really the limitation again is going to be this inside of the tire here hitting the link down in here as it swings in. But I was getting at 50 degrees of steering, and I'm going to limit the ram so I don't necessarily need all 50 degrees anyway. The pinion is still staying neutral throughout the cycle. I didn't cycle it all the way down, obviously, because I need to slide the chassis forward, but I'm feeling a lot better about this wheelbase. I'm at 118-ish. It's hard to measure without both axles being completely level. I would need to take tires off and make sure everything's at the same amount of droop, and or check it at proposed ride height, which I can't really do right now because it's on the chassis table again. So I think what I'm gonna do is move on to this back section, solidify the changes I made yesterday. I need to throw the spare tire up on there again, check that, make sure it is where I want it. And these tubes here, I'm gonna need to trim those off and put my uprights back in there. I like the way the body lines look, everything flows correctly, and I really need to start working on this front end. So probably solidify this by tack welding this tail section in again, making sure everything's square. I think it is. I messed with it quite a bit yesterday. And really all I did by trimming this tail section, taking 3 inches out, is move this fuel cell up forward and get it closer to this rear firewall. So I've still got plenty of room between the fuel cell and the rear firewall for radiator, coolers, whatever. So I'm good there. Yeah. So that's what it is. All right, onward. I should get the engine hoist to do this. Should. All right, so what I'm going to do is attempt to show you how I'm going to do these tubes. The front end tubes here that are rolled or radiused, I radiused or rolled on a Swag modified Harbor Freight tubing roller. It's the same one you can buy. You can buy the accessories for it to make it a little bit better. These tubes started out as one solid stick, 12-foot stick. When you're rolling or radiusing a piece of tubing, you will have at the end of the tubing, depending on what type of roller you're using, it'll give you a section of straight tube before the radius starts because of the way the dies are set up on the roller. And these two have about a 12-inch, it's a little bit more than 12-inch. So what I did was I took the one solid piece of radius tube that was originally 12 foot and eyeballed it, laid it on the concrete, cut it in half. Then I laid them together, one on top of the other, and I made sure that they were exact mirrors of each other on the straight end here, okay? Then I put them up on the chassis, and I rolled each tube inward to 50 degree with the angle finder here. I've moved it so it doesn't say 50 degree now, but after I did that, I checked for rough level, and then I marked at the same point from this joint on both tubes on the inside of where I want the bend to be. See the mark right there. So what I'm going to do now, because the bend has to be on this straight section of tubing, and I want the tubes to dive inward a little bit. That's why I need to put a little bend in there, a little kick. So what I'm going to do now is attempt to explain how I do it on the tubing bender. These two tubes have to be exact mirrors of each other. So it's a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try to explain it. Okay, so I've got my digital angle finder on this tubing clamp, and I've got this other little C clamp on here because for some reason they had this to where it could rotate, and I don't want it to rotate because obviously if it rotates, it affects the readout. We have our radius tube here. The radius end of the tube is going to slide through the bender. This straight portion is where the take-up for the bend will be. You're always going to have a take-up in the bend. The die, this is the portion that's going to curve around the die, and that's going to take up some of this straight area. So we want this display to be facing toward us, and you'll see what I mean when I put it in the bender. So we'll go ahead and zero this out. We have this horizontally mounted on the table here. All right, so if you remember I said this curved portion is going to slide through our bender first. Now I'm looking for that mark that I added. There's our mark. There's our mark. I don't know if you can see it. It's right in there. And our die says 11.6. So that's the reference we need to have for the opposite side. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of preload on the die to make sure we're at 0, 0. Right here it should be calibrated for about 0. Right there you can kind of feel it's starting to bend. I'm going to go 0 there, 0 it out. I'm going to put, we'll say, I'm going to start with about 10 degrees of bend. You always overbend. On this one I'm going to overbend 3 degrees just to get that spring back out. So I'm at 13.3. For reference, in case I've got to load this thing back in here, I'm going to go ahead and mark the heck out of this. Make sure that if I need to load it back in here, it'll be loaded up in the same position. All right, now I can go ahead and release this. I'm going to go ahead and take this off. And I can pull this thing out. All right, so there you go. This straight section on the tube will get trimmed back so that there's just enough tube here to attach it to that internal sleeve. And then you can see how it kicked that front end inward a considerable amount. Like these are really close to, well, 7, 8 inches away. But you can see how it kind of kicked in over there. Now it gives it a profile a little bit different where it kind of rises up and then goes back down after the cab section there. So yeah, that's a good image, a good picture of what it might look like. We needed to kick these uppers in that way because as the tire articulates, it's going to want to come up in here. Our shock's going to be mounted in here on this side of it. A little bit tricky, and it's a lot of work, but that's what gives this chassis a unique look, and that's, you know, why I continue doing it. I really like the look of it. So I think I'm going to call it a day. I've been fretting over this thing and working on it, and you guys saw the beginning of the video. It's been success today. I'm going to quit on a good note, spend the rest of the day hanging out with the girls, with my family. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. We'll catch you on the next one.